Good morning.
Good morning.
So we have with us UNDP resident representative Abdallah Al Dardari. Thank you very much for your time. And we'll talk about the situation in Afghanistan today, particularly the state of economy. But to understand the situation where we are today, let's look at where we were before the events of August 2021. So what was the state of economy prior to the events in 2021?
Well, GDP was going down, poverty was increasing. COVID-19 really affected the Afghan economy and the Afghan population. Average GDP growth has been going down in the past 5 years, not just immediately prior to COVID-19. In general, productivity and competitiveness were going, in fact, either stagnant or being reduced. At the same time, we noticed that in the past 20 years, since 2001 until 2020, poverty levels have been increasing, and so have unemployment rates. Despite some positive growth rates in the past 20 years, an average growth rate of about 5%, unemployment kept increasing and poverty kept increasing. So that shows that the Afghan economy and the economic model was not inclusive, was not productive in that sense of generating decent jobs for Afghan youth. Youth unemployment was very high. So we faced COVID-19 with a vulnerable economic situation, and then faced 15 August with all these vulnerabilities manifesting themselves in the economy.
There was also a drought, right? Many said it was a historic drought that affected the agricultural yield that summer. Okay, so we've heard from you what was the economy just before August 15. What was then the immediate impact of the change in Afghanistan?
Well, if I may just go 1 minute to pre-August 15 to say that the Afghan economy was mainly a grant aid-based economy. It relied heavily on aid. 75% of the budget was funded by grant aid from donors. 40% of GDP almost was from grant aid. So that's why the main impact of 15 August is the immediate cessation of all the grant aid. And that is a dramatic shock in demand, meaning that there is no resources to have a demand side in the economy. There was a lot of disruption in the supply side, the imports of products, the raw material, the inputs into processing and production. All of those two dual shock. This is not a typical situation. This is a unique situation. And therefore, we saw a contraction in GDP of about 20% in 6 months. That's a 40% annualized drop in GDP. That's a dramatic drop in GDP. And we started seeing the impact of this drop on unemployment, with about 700 to 900,000 additional unemployed joining the unemployment lines in Afghanistan.
Oh, these are dramatic figures. Let's focus in the next question on the impact on women and the gender policies, particularly the impact on women in participation in Afghan economy.
The most dramatic manifestation of what happened on 15 August is, as I said, the large number of newly unemployed people. There is, of course, a disproportionate number of women unemployed as part of this new cohort, which meant that there was a reduction of 16% of female labor market participation. We estimate that the cost of this 16% drop in female labor market participation varies between $600 million to $1 billion every year. It also costed around $500 million to household incomes in the first 6 months after August 15. So the withdrawal or the partial withdrawal of women from the economy has had already dramatic impact on the Afghan economy, and we believe it will even have more dramatic impact in the future, because female labor market participation was characterized by actually an average higher productivity rate than males in the Afghan economy. So losing those women in the economy will have dramatic medium to long-term consequences.
So we covered the impact it had on government spending, the impact it had on growth, the impact it had on participation of women, but also the general unemployment. All of those figures are significant. So where are we today, 12 months on? What is the state of Afghan economy?
Well, we can see what we call a minimum equilibrium situation in the Afghan economy. So the inflationary shock has been almost absorbed, and the exchange rate is showing stability. The reason for that is that the money supply, both in US dollars and in Afghani, is low and at a balance, at an equilibrium, because the central bank cannot print new Afghanis, and because the UN has brought more than $2 billion to the economy, including around $1 billion in cash. So there is what we call a minimum equilibrium situation in the economy. We also see some return to some growth, or let's say a much lower deterioration rates in 2022 than in 2021. Our estimation that growth will be minus 7.5 in 22, while we project some return to positive growth in 23. That's normal after such a dramatic drop. We also see some stabilization in trade and, in fact, some increase in exports. We estimate that exports will reach about $2 billion in 2022 compared to almost $1.2 billion in 2020. So that is a positive increase in some sense, which is leading to better revenue in foreign currency to the country. And we also noticed that the drop in imports that we had projected in September 2021 is not as dramatic. We projected a drop from $7 billion imports to around $3 billion. We see that imports today stand at $4.7 billion, which means that there is hard currency to fund imports in the country. So according to the impressions of the business people we are talking to, the worst is over. Is that situation sustainable? That's a big question we have to deal with.
UNDP published a seminal outlook, economic outlook report 2021-2022 that was widely covered and referred by the professional and expert community and policymakers around the world. But at the same time, UNDP published a paper on the state of banking system. What is the role of the financial systems and the banking system in the economic recovery work? Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, let's agree in principle, there is no economy without a banking system. Banking is an extremely important function of intermediation between savings and lending and investments and finance of trade. So these are extremely important functions. I have to say that despite the challenges, the fierce challenges faced by the Afghan banking system, the banking system so far has survived. And I must also say that the short-term measures, the emergency measures undertaken by DAB, the Afghanistan Central Bank, have proven successful so far in containing the conflict, in preventing the collapse of the banking system. Now, again, this is not a long-term solution. There has to be an intervention to support the banking sector, and this is why UNDP, along with other partners, are putting together a program to support the Afghan banking system. So we have to resume banking activities, and also we have to save people's savings in those banks. I mean, a collapse of the banks may mean wiping out billions of Afghanis that are the savings of ordinary Afghans, and we definitely don't want this to happen.
Thank you, Abdallah, for the summary of where the economy as well as the financial systems are today. The big question is, where do we need to go next? Where do we go now?
Well, Afghanistan needs large sums of money to resume economic activities. According to some recent research, the country requires billions of dollars to resume its pre-15 August growth trajectory. And even if it does, even if it receives around $2 billion on development funding, it will only capture the pre-15 August growth trajectory by 2032. So Afghanistan is facing a tremendous challenge. Our estimate as UNDP that with the current situation continuing until 2030, we will only achieve 30% of SDG targets. Even at the best case scenario, meaning that there is peace and tranquility and that the country manages to receive or generate $67 billion of development spending, it will only achieve 46% of SDGs, which means that what the country requires is a dramatic change in its economic model. An economic model that relies on top-down instructions and orders and on large investments funded by aid is no longer viable. Hence our work towards the bottom-up, trickle-up economic approach that we are proposing for Afghanistan.
The context has changed significantly over the past 12 months. How have we changed? What do we do differently to address the needs of the people of Afghanistan?
You know, the classical development cooperation is no longer viable at the moment. There is a government that, de facto authority that we do not recognize officially, and therefore we cannot have development cooperation agreements and funding through the government institutions. That's one thing. So we had to immediately seize our what we call national implementation projects that were implemented through government line ministries, and move to something we call direct implementation, where UNDP would directly implement with partners on the ground, international and national NGOs and private sector, where we directly implement activities that supports the people and the communities directly. That's one thing. The other thing is, as I said before, classical development does not work anymore, because classical development and economic theories, which requires a very strong central planning or a strong macroeconomic indicators, it doesn't exist at the moment, and therefore we don't see that the fiscal policy of the state is a strong tool for reviving the economy. Again, we as a UN system have to work straight, directly to the ground with the people, inject cash into the hands of the people, provide access to finance, direct training, capacity building, in order for the people to generate their own revenues through small and micro enterprises, through community level infrastructures that would enhance the resilience of those communities and allow them to start some recovery. It's a big challenge. And also it is a very innovative way of approaching development. And now we are talking about development assistance rather than development cooperation. We don't do development cooperation with the state, but we do development assistance to the people of Afghanistan.
At the end, let's circle to the beginning, where you mentioned that There was, over the past 2 decades, tremendous investment into Afghanistan, but the growth was not inclusive. It was very narrow, and the poverty increased from 34 to 70%, in spite of all that investment. So what are we doing now to ensure that the growth and the development is inclusive and it reaches the people that need aid? What are some of the concrete activities that UNDP and others are doing to reach the people who indeed need help in this difficult situation?
We're doing, first of all, we launched a big program called ABADE, Area-Based Approach to Development Emergency. ABADE is mainly a program to reach the people of Afghanistan, to provide them, as I said, with access to finance. We are targeting 50,000 women-owned enterprises for grant aid, for soft loans, for technical assistance, for connecting them into clusters, for ensuring that they have domestic and international markets for their products. We are aiming at creating 2 million jobs in the next 3 years. This is, we believe that we will apply what we call in economics an inverse Oken law. Oken law is growth leading to a proportionate percentage of employment. At the moment, we would like to create employment at the micro level, at the ground level, and see how much growth it will generate at the macro level. So that's a completely new approach. We're calling it trickle-up economics rather than trickle-down economics. Now, 2 million jobs that we want to create through micro-enterprises, small enterprises, providing access to finance to 50,000 women enterprises. We are also supporting innovative youth projects. We want the young people of Afghanistan to be able to be free and innovate and propose interesting projects, and they are brilliant entrepreneurial people. So, in fact, the changes that happened on 15 August may ironically provide an opportunity for the UN to change the way it works in Afghanistan, for the UN and the international community to start thinking and acting on how do we have an inclusive growth that benefits the poor and the women and young people, rather than a growth that is narrow and benefits a small group of business community. So the work is tremendous. We are also starting a big program for private sector recovery in Afghanistan, focusing on the small private sector. The big people, the big cronies, if I may use that term, can manage. It is the small people that we want to support. As I said before, it is the marginalized, it's the minorities, it's the people with disabilities that we want to empower them to be able to set up their own enterprises. So also we are focusing now on renewable energy. There is no economic recovery without renewable energy. So we have designed a business model for hybrid mini grids that could supply power, industrial parks and business real estate and commercial real estate with power enough for them to restart their businesses and their industries. So massive operation is happening today, UNDP, but also with everyone else in the UN system, a much more coordinated UN system. We can see that happening, and we are utilizing every dollar to optimize the impact of every dollar we receive from donors.
And what has been the response of the international community? What is the funding situation?
We have been receiving some considerable funding, but Afghanistan needs much more. I have to stress that when the UN system requested 8.4 billion for the first transitional engagement framework for the year 22. There is a very important concept I'd like to stress upon. We should not repeat the experience of an aid-dependent economy. What we need to do is to spend that money in order to generate domestic engines of growth and of revenues and even of fiscal revenues. So revenue for the ordinary people and also revenue for the state to be able to perform the public goods that are needed in infrastructure, education, health, and so on. So the question is not only how much we receive, it is how do we spend this money? Do we just go back and repeat the past, or do we make sure that every dollar we spend here creates domestic engines of growth in the economy? So money is coming. I cannot deny there's good sums of money received by the UN so far, by UNDP. We need much more, but we also need to have a compact with our donors that we are not trying to repeat the past. We are not going to try to ask for 20 more years of the same levels of aid that we had in the previous 20 years. It's very important to highlight that what we are trying to do through this trickle-up economics is empowering ordinary people. And while we focus on the development and the humanitarian aspects, we believe that this empowerment of women, youth, marginalized minorities, and the poor, most importantly, the majority of Afghans. So if we want to talk about a democratic economic process, it is a process that touches the majority of Afghans. The majority of Afghans are the poor. So this is the proposal we are putting forward, an empowerment of the poor and the marginalized.
Thank you, UNDP Resident Representative in Afghanistan, Abdallah Al Dardari. It was a pleasure. Thank you for the informative briefing.
Thank you very much.